Inside this courtroom, 4 Navajo women are on trial for interfering with the construction of a fence that is being built across their land. The fence will divide families and cut them off from their traditional grazing lands, watering holes, and shrines.
It's going to be very hard for our elders because most of our elders that are in there listening can't understand or speak English. And it's going to be very hard for them to understand the laws of the United States government. Who is going to say, okay, you Indian, Mr. Indian, you're going to have to leave. And there's going to be no questions asked, you know. And that's what's happening right there in that courthouse.
Their land has been awarded to the Hopi tribe, and 6,000 Navajo who have lived here for generations are soon to be forcibly relocated. A traditional and unique way of life will be terminated.
Some of the effects of relocation I'm not sure any white person can understand, but trying to size it up, trying to understand, it's almost as if they've lost a portion of their soul when they no longer can return to that land. The land that has really defined them, to themselves, their connection to their family, to the livestock, to the shrines, to the mountains that are around them. If they lose this, then they are losing the thing that is most precious to them, which we might call our soul.
We've learned, there have been quite a few studies to date of compulsory relocation of rural people. And we've found that where you're dealing with rural populations, without much education and with very strong ties to the land, irrespective of where they live, and irrespective of their genetic background, their language, their culture, and irrespective of government policy, to forcibly relocate such people is about the worst thing that you can do them. One would forecast that there would be increased death rates among the relocatees, increased rates of sickness. This would be both mental illness and physical illness. One would also expect psychological stress. I would also be willing to say that the forced relocation of the District 6 people, these were 15 families who were relocated from District 6, Navajo, in 1972. Between 1972 and 1978, 9 adults, or approximately 25% of the adult population of those 15 families, died. Now, that, of course, is much higher than you would expect, generally speaking, and although we can't prove that the relocation was the major reason for this very high death rate, again, I personally am convinced that it was a major factor involved, that it increased the amount of drinking among the elderly men and among the women. It therefore was a factor in the alcohol abuse, which led to the death of both men and women after their eviction in 1972. Now here you have to remember that although the legislation provides for the purchase of land, no land, in fact, has yet been purchased for the Navajo relocatees. So unlike most relocation projects, these people don't even know where they're going to be moved.
We don't know the cities is the main thing. And we don't know how to live on city, and we live on weaving and sheep, and you know, we using sheep so many ways. We shirting and spinning and making this kind, and making their bed, blanket, and some people, they just buy it and they need them. And even we went to sell it to the trading post to buy our groceries. And the government was trying to cut this kind. They just want to get rid of them. We don't know. And we don't know what's going on at Window Rock and Washington. We don't know anything about it.
They just come in and do things.
Yes, they just come in and do fencing. And only thing, this law was been approved again. It's only here. It's only one word we heard.
Let's talk a little bit more about what stress means. In the Navajo case, it translates into extreme depression. And extreme depression, which is afflicting the elderly, both men and women, and depression which is also afflicting younger Navajo women. Again, I think that Anglos who have not had experience with low-income populations, rural populations with strong ties to the land, and specifically with the Navajo, they just can't understand what's involved. They can't understand how a person's, a family's, a kinship entity's ties to the land can be so great that if you lose that land, sickness and increased death rates will follow.
Our mother is the earth, which all the plants, whatever it's on earth is, some of it is our food, and some are medicines, and that's how we live on. And as though we are the children of our Mother Earth, and how she feeds us is causing the whole thing. We're going through suffering from everything that what the BIA is doing to my nation.
Well, the issue historically goes back almost 100 years. But beginning with 100 years in 1882, we had a series of compounding of errors administratively and then I think later judicially. And now we're at the point where this compounding of, it seems to me, of misconceptions and mistakes and hesitant actions and negligence, really, has created the situation where we're going to have this extraordinary upheaval.
In 1863, the United States government launched a campaign to force the Navajo, who was scattered throughout the Southwest, into captivity. Colonel Kit Carson spearheaded a brutal and unrelenting campaign, destroying crops and livestock and forcing some 8,500 Navajo on the long walk to Fort Sumner in eastern New Mexico. The Navajo could either surrender or starve. The government program at Fort Sumner was a total disaster. Plagued by inadequate food and water sources, the Army finally recognized the futility of relocation, and in 1868 a treaty was signed creating a reservation. The Navajo were allowed to return home. Back in their homeland, the Navajo flourished. But with the loss of much of their best land in western New Mexico to non-Indian settlers, and with the tribe's rapid population growth, pressures on the land soon increased. As the Navajos spread westward, returning to lands they had previously occupied, the reservation borders were extended. Surrounded by Navajo neighbors, the Hopi tribe lived in villages clustered atop the desert mesas. A Pueblo people, the Hopis farmed small corn and melon fields near their villages, returning each evening to participate in the rich ceremonial life of the tribe. In 1882, an executive order established a reservation for the Hopi and, quote, such other Indians as the Secretary of the Interior shall see fit to settle thereon, unquote. The boundaries of the new reservation were hastily and arbitrarily drawn. Several hundred Navajo already lived within its borders. Some had lived there for centuries. Although the 1882 reservation was intended for the Hopi, the wording of the executive order left room for interpretation, and it was with the knowledge and consent of government officials that the Navajo, in search of new grazing land, continued to move into the unmarked land. In the early 1900s, the Navajo reservation was again expanded. As part of the U.S. government's stock reduction program in the 1940s to curb overgrazing of the land, grazing districts were created. Grazing District 6 was set aside for Hopi use. Records show that the intent of government officials was to limit Hopi lands. In 1962, the court ruled that District 6 was to be considered the exclusive Hopi reservation, and that the balance of the 1882 reservation belonged to both tribes to share equally. It was called the Joint Use Area. There matters rested until, in 1974, Congress passed Public Law 93-531, authorizing that the joint use area be partitioned between the two tribes.
Well, in order to get a Congress, the great bulk of whom knew very little about Indian affairs and cared very little about what was happening out here in the Southwest, a climate of hysteria was manufactured back in the early 1970s. Congress was made to believe that unless it intervened with this piece of legislation, there was going to be a bloodbath between the two tribes. The Navajos and the Hopis were about to go to war, and that Congress would have blood on its hands unless it passed legislation that would stop this. Well, I mean, that's just patently false. Press releases were fed through a Salt Lake City public relations firm. TV crews were invited in to be told a story of the range being ready to break out into flames. You know, two implacable foes were getting ready to go at it. It just wasn't true. Most Hopis are not concerned about seeing the Navajos relocated. There's a very small central core of Hopis who are going to benefit from relocation. That's pointed out by a book written by a Hopi himself, a man named Albert Yava, who says that he talks about what you might call a new Hopi elite, who are going to be able to use this land to expand their cattle herds. And he says very few Hopis are going to benefit from this program of kicking the Navajos off the land.
We want the world to know that it's not these Hopi leaders, Kikmungwis, traditional people, are involved in this kind of a plan to relocate the Navajos. We know there were troubles in the past. We know there were individuals battles with one another. But as a tribe, we have lived peacefully a long time. They come back to the villages and we go to their homes. They provide food, meat, and trade our melon and corn, beans. And there are many intermarrying between two tribes. And there's no really hard feeling against those people. As long as they respect each other, they're allowed to live in this land and take care of it for all of our leaders.
The dominant political figures who have been involved are Senator Barry Goldwater, former Senator Paul Fannin, and former Representative Sam Steiger, all of Arizona, all of whom had a great credibility back in Washington talking about a local Indian situation. Most people back in Washington could not presume to understand what was happening out here in a corner of Arizona, and they deferred to the presumed expertise of these three men. And these three men, it seems to me, distorted the situation terribly and misunderstood what was going on out here.
The land was divided, and a federal relocation commission was established to plan the relocation of some 6,000 Navajo and 100 Hopi who suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of a fence.
There were several laws that were proposed. None were very acceptable to the Navajos, and the Congress said, well, let's partition the land. They really didn't think about the moving of people. They were thinking about the partitioning of the land. That was the foremost thing in their mind. The relocation was a consequence or a result of that land partition.
Our total budget for relocation is, let me see, originally I guess it was $35 million for just the housing part, which is the biggest chunk. That's what we were authorized. Now, because of inflation, we've used up about 27 million of that 35 million. So we have consistently warned Congress that because it costs a lot more for houses than it did when you passed this act, 1974, we have to come back to you for more money, which we will do in fiscal year 1982. So we have to go back to Congress. I suppose what you're getting at is the projection for the overall cost of this whole program. It's a ballpark figure around here, something like $225 million.
We have to realize that that is to relocate them from a housing point of view. It will not improve their job opportunities. It will not provide land. It will not decrease the proportion of Navajo on welfare. Indeed, it will increase the proportion. So you're spending $200 million to make some 6,000 people, the majority of them, worse off than they were before. At the time that I wrote this report with my colleagues, I felt very strongly that Public Law 93-531 should be repealed. I feel just as strongly that that is the case today, which of course means that one should come up with some constructive options, some constructive alternate plans. And this is, of course, it's tremendously important to emphasize that this land dispute is a tragic dispute because it does involve two Native American groups, and also, of course, ultimately, the responsibility for this dispute lies with the federal government. So in working out an option, we need to work out an option which achieves two minimum objectives. One, it keeps forced relocation to the absolute minimum and hopefully eliminates it entirely. And at the same time, corrects for the lack of development that has been going on in the joint use area for Navajo over an extended period of time. So stop the forced relocation and bring in a development program for the Navajo on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's equally important to remember that the Hopi do have a legitimate claim, and that it is important, therefore, to allocate significant funds for the purchase of alternate land for the Hopi and for a major economic development program. Now, if we bear in mind that just the physical relocation of Navajo will cost over $200 million, you can imagine that what, let's say, half of that, $100 million, could do for a joint land purchase and development program for both Hopi and Navajo, but eliminating the forced relocation component.
We have this extraordinary group of Americans whose culture is certainly fading. It's under all sorts of pressures, which is attempting to adapt gradually, which is making all sorts of compromises, subject to all sorts of stress, that now through this act of Congress is being terminated. It's being invalidated. It's being forced to get off its center, the land. That's the integrating principle of the culture. And I say, why? What's going to be gained by this incredibly expensive thing? Expensive in human terms, expensive in dollars. And this thing could have been settled with such greater ease and at such less cost in a much more rational fashion.
I told the relocation commissioner, I went over there, my roots is way down deep. It can't be pulled out, that's what I've said. And especially all my older people, great-great-grandmother is buried there, and my great-great-grandmother and father and grandmother and my aunt and my mother, my father and brothers, and even my children. They're just buried just among where I am. So I just not able to leave anywhere. I'm just going to remain